I propose to confer within the coming month with small groups of those directly representative of large employers of labor and of large groups of organized labor in order to seek their cooperation in establishing what I may describe as a specific trial period of industrial peace. Some people try to tell me that we must make up our minds that for the future we shall permanently have millions of unemployed, just as other countries have had them for over a decade. What may be necessary for those other countries is not my responsibility to determine. But as for this country, I stand or fall by my refusal to accept as a necessary condition of our future a permanent army of unemployed.
In my chapter 6, we discussed the Great Depression and how social policy was used to address the economic crisis. To begin, I want to say that the Great Depression was the worst economic catastrophe in American history. It took place in the 1930s. Back in the 1930s, during the Second American Industrial Revolution, people were buying a lot of new items like cars, radios, and electricity on credit. They even bought stocks with credit. During the 1920s, there was a situation where the stock market prices rose higher and higher. The textbook says when stock prices plunged, panicked investors rushed to sell their stocks, leading to even greater declines in stock prices. The panic and frenzy that took place with the stock market spread to the banks. Back in these times, banks had limited resources of money. They were local, and when the local bank ran out of resources, the bank went under. Banks overextended themselves, giving out loans for money that they did not have. Word soon spread that the banks were running out of money. And as this word spread, people began to panic, and they went and they took their money out of the banks. And a lot of banks went under because of this. They went bankrupt, basically. And because the stock market and banks went under, businesses started to go under. Since now that no one could afford to buy foods and services, the employers of these businesses reduced their prices so that people would be able to buy their product. Since the businesses reduced their prices, they were making less money, and because they were making less money, they had to lay off workers. They couldn't afford to pay their workers anymore, and because of this, unemployment rose to about 25%. This catastrophe caused countless to go hungry. Undereating and malnutrition occurred, suicide, selling possessions, people lived in tents. All sorts of distress took place. This catastrophe affected all people no matter their social class. One thing I thought was interesting to look at within the chapter was the way the Great Depression affected the already oppressed. For example, women, African Americans, Asians, and Latinos. During the Great Depression, about 20% of all women lost their employment. During this time period, it was especially difficult for women to be able to support themselves, not because they were somehow inferior, but because of the expectations society placed on women. The textbook exclaims that women were expected to give up their jobs for men, and the women were supposed to become stay-at-home mothers. In the South, where Jim Crow segregation laws and the Ku Klux Klan reigned, African Americans were disenfranchised. When businesses in the South were faced with layoff decisions, African Americans were laid off first, and their white counterparts were kept. There was fear among the whites that because of the Works Progress Administration, African Americans would achieve higher economic status than the normal status quo. Because of racism, there was discrimination in unions and jobs and service programs that were supposed to provide resources and employment for everyone. As I said before, the Great Depression was a catastrophe that could only be combated by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal programs, or reforms, if you will. The textbook says reforms during and immediately after the Great Depression can be best understood by analyzing the unfolding of reform in 5 periods, or eras, if you will. First, there was the era of denial. I like to think of this as the era where everyone was so stunned and so shocked by the Great Depression that they were kind of all just standing still. Secondly, the period of emergency reform. I think this ties in with President Roosevelt's reforms in the New Deal. He came up with the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, the NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. These were types of programs and reforms to help individuals and Americans get off their feet and can kind of get back to work and make sure that the Great Depression kind of like never really happened again. In the era of institutionalized reform, Americans made a number of these reforms that I just mentioned permanent. They became a part of the institution. They became a part of our system of what we do in America. I feel like after reading this chapter in the beginning, Americans really loved these reforms because they were seeing, I guess, a little bit of immediate help. Even though these reforms didn't do, critical damage to the Great Depression, these Americans were getting back to work, and they were being able to work on bridges and national parks to the CCC, and artists and things like that were being able to feed themselves again. And because of this, President Roosevelt was kind of seen as the people's champ. I even believe in the textbook they mentioned that Roosevelt was seen as invincible. During the era of policy stalemate, there was a bit of political swaying. The middle-class Americans began to distrust Roosevelt due to fears of him becoming too powerful. They felt like he was gaining too much power and seeking too much power in the laws that he was trying to pass. I believe I read in the chapter that there was a law where he was trying to make Supreme Court justices only allowed to stay in office for 70 years, to where you have to retire after you reach the age of 70. And people just didn't like that. They felt like he was trying to work the courts to where he could pass whatever laws he wanted. And during this era, the American people believed that they were responsible for their own unemployment. They also disliked the brain trust in academians and theorists whose ideas had not solved the nation's economic mouse. The final era, the era of pullback, is when we could say that the Great Depression ended. The Great Depression came to an end due to severely increased military spending. By President Roosevelt increasing the size of the military, he gave 8.5 million men employment.